Chapter 16 of Inspector French's Greatest Case by Freeman, Wills, Crofts. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. Inspector French's Greatest Case, Chapter 16, A Hot Scent. Inspector French had now so many points of attack in his inquiry that he felt somewhat at a loss as to which he should proceed with first. The tracing of Mrs. Vane was the immediate goal, but it was by no means clear which particular line of inquiry would most surely and rapidly lead to that end. Nothing would be easier than to spend time on side issues, and in this case a few hours might make all the difference between success and failure. The lady had already had 5 days' start, and he could not afford to allow her to increase her lead by a single unnecessary minute. He considered the matter while he lunched, eventually concluding that the first step was the discovery of the maid, Susan Scott. The preliminary spade work of this required no skill and could be done by an assistant, leaving himself free for other inquiries. Accordingly, he returned to the yard and set 2 men to work, one to make a list of all the registry offices in the Edgware Road district, the other to ring up those agencies one by one and inquire if the girl's name was on their books. Then he went in to see his chief, told him of his discoveries, and obtained the necessary authority to interrogate the manager of Mrs. Vane's bank on the affairs of that lady. He reached the bank just before closing time and was soon closeted with the manager. Mr. Harrod, once satisfied that his usual professional reticence might in this case be set aside, gave him some quite interesting information. Mrs. Vane had opened an account with them some 5 years earlier, about the same time French noted, as a house in St. John's Wood Road had been leased. Her deposit had not been large, seldom amounting to and never exceeding £1,000. It had stood at from 4 to 800 until comparatively recently, but within the past few months it had dwindled until some 10 weeks earlier it had vanished altogether. Indeed, the payment of a cheque presented at this period had involved an overdraft of some £15, and the teller had consulted Mr. Harrod before cashing it. Mr. Harrod, knowing True Lodge and the scale on which the Vanes lived, had not hesitated in giving the necessary authority, and his judgment had proved correct, for some 3 days later Mrs. Vane had personally lost over £100. This had since been drawn upon, and there remained at the present time a balance of £11 odd in the lady's favour. All this information seemed to French to work in with the case he was endeavouring to make. The Vanes had apparently been living beyond their income, or at least Mrs. Vane had been living beyond hers, and she was finding it increasingly difficult to make ends meet. He did not see that any other interpretation of the dwindling balance and the overdraft could be found. That overdraft represented, he imagined, part of the lady's ticket to America. Then £100 was paid the very next day, as he soon saw, to that on which Mr. Williams had paid Mrs. X at £3,000. Here was at least a suggestion of motive for the robbery, and also the first fruits of its accomplishment. Moreover, the subsequent withdrawal of all but a small balance, left doubtless to disarm suspicion, would unquestionably work in with the theory of flight. On the whole, French was well pleased with the results of his call. But he was even more pleased to find on his return to the yard that his assistants had located a registry office whose books included the name of Susan Scott. By some extraordinary chance, the very first call they made struck oil. The men, of course, had realized that there must be many Susan Scotts in London, but when they found that this one had placed her name on the firm's book on the day before Mrs. Vane's departure, they felt sure that they were on the right track. They had not therefore proceeded further with their inquiry, but had spent their time trying to locate the inspector with the object of passing on the information with a minimum of delay. The address was Mrs. Gill, 75 Horswell Street, Edgware Road, and thither, before many minutes had passed, Inspector French was wending his way. The registry office was a small concern consisting of only 2 rooms in a private house in a quiet street running out of Edgware Road. In the outer were 2 young women of the servant class, and these eyed French curiously, evidently seeing in him a prospective employer. Mrs. Gill was engaged with a 3rd girl, but a few seconds after French's arrival she took her departure, and he was called into the private room. The lady was not at first inclined to be communicative, but when French revealed his profession and threatened her with the powers and majesty of the law, she became profusely apologetic and anxious to help. She looked up her books and informed him that the girl was lodging in number 31 Norfolk Terrace, Mistletoe Road. As it was close by, French walked to the place. Here again his luck held in a way that he began to consider almost uncanny. A tall, coarsely good-looking blonde opened the door and announced in answer to his inquiry that she herself was Miss Scott. Soon he was sitting opposite to her in a tiny parlor, while she stared at him with something approaching insolence out of her rather bold eyes. French, sizing her up rapidly, was courteous but firm. He began by ostentatiously laying his notebook on the table, opening it at a fresh page, and after saying, "Miss Susan Scott, isn't it?" wrote the name at the head of the sheet. "Now, Miss Scott," he announced briskly, "I'm Inspector French from Scotland Yard, and I'm investigating a case of murder and robbery." He paused, and seeing the girl was duly impressed, continued, "It happens that your recent mistress, Mrs. Vane, is wanted to give evidence in the case, and I have come to you for some information about where to find her." The girl made an exclamation of surprise, and a look, partly of fear and partly of thrilled delight, appeared in her blue eyes. "I don't know anything about her," she declared. "I'm sure you know quite a lot," French returned. "All I want is to ask you some questions. If you answer them truly, you have nothing to fear. But as you probably know, there are very serious penalties indeed for keeping back evidence. You could be sent to prison for that." Having by these remarks banished the girl's look of insolence and reduced her to a suitable frame of mind, French got on to business. "Am I right in believing that you have been until last Friday house and parlourmaid to Mrs. Vane of Crewe Lodge, St. John's Wood Road?" "Yes, I was there for about 3 months." French, to assist not only his own memory but the impressiveness of the interview, noted the reply in his book. 3 months, he repeated deliberately. "Very good. Now, why did you leave?" "Because I had to," the girl said sulkily. "Mrs. Vane was closing the house." French nodded. "So I understand. Tell me what happened, please. Just in your own words." "She came in that afternoon shortly before 4, all fussed-like and hurrying, and said she was leaving immediately for New York. She said she had just had a cable that Mr. Vane had had an accident there and they were afraid he wouldn't get over it. She said for cook to get her some tea while I helped her pack. She just threw her clothes in a suitcase. My word, if I had done packing like that, I shouldn't half have coped it. By the time she had finished, cook had tea ready, and while mistress was having it, cook and I packed. I started to clear away the tea things, but mistress said there wasn't time for that, for me just to leave them and run out and get 2 taxis. She said there was a special for the American boat that she must catch. So I got the taxis, and she got into one, and cook and I into the other, and we drove away together. That's all I know about it." "What time was that?" "4:30, I should think. I didn't look." "Where did you get the taxis?" "On the stand at the end of the Gardiner Street." "Who gave Mrs. Vane's taximan his address?" "I did. It was Euston." "It was rather hard lines on you and the cook, turning you out like that at a moment's notice. I hope she made it up to you?" Miss Scott smiled scornfully. "That was all right," she answered. "We told her about it, and she gave us a $5 apiece, as well as a month's wages." "Not so bad," French admitted. "Who locked up the house?" "She did, and took the key." "And what happened to you and cook?" "We drove on here, and I got out. This is my sister's house, you understand. Cook went on to Paddington. She lives in Reading, somewhere down that way. Mrs. Vane said that when she came back, she would look us up, and if we were disengaged, we could come back to her. But she said not to keep out of a place for her, as she didn't know how long she might have to stay in America." French paused in thought, then went on. "Was Mrs. Vane much from home while you were with her?" "No, she was only away once, but she stayed over 3 weeks that time. It's a bit strange that it was an accident too. Her sister in Scotland fell and broke a collarbone, so she told us, and she had to go to keep house till she was better. Somewhere in Scotland, she said." "When was that?" The girl hesitated. "I don't know that I could say exactly," she answered at least. "She's back about 6 weeks or 2 months, and she left over 3 weeks before that. About a couple of weeks after I went. Say about 10 weeks altogether." This was distinctly satisfactory. Mrs. Vane's absence seemed to cover the period of Mrs. X's visit to America. "I should like to fix the exact dates if I could," French persisted, "or at least the date she came back. Just think, will you please? Is there nothing you can remember by?" The girl presumably thought, for she was silent for some moments, but her cogitations were unproductive. She shook her head. Did you stay in the house while she was away? No. I came here and Cook went home. This was better. The attention of a number of people had been drawn to the date, and some one of them should surely be able to fix it. On what day of the week did you go back? French prompted. The girl considered this. It was Thursday, she said at last. I remember that now because Thursday is my night out, and I remembered thinking that that week I shouldn't get it. French was delighted with the reply. It was on a Thursday night, 7 weeks earlier, that Mrs. X had driven from the Savoy to Victoria, left her boxes there, and vanished. The thing was working in. What time of the day did she arrive? In the evening, Miss Scott answered promptly this time. It was 8:30, 8:45. Better and better. Mrs. X left the Savoy shortly before 8, and it would take her about 3/4 of an hour to arrive to Victoria, leave her trunks in the left luggage office, and get out to St. John's Wood Road. Now, French went on, if you or your sister could just remember the week that happened, I should be very much obliged. Susan Scott sat with a heavy frown on her rather pretty features. Concentrated thought was evidently an unwanted exercise, but at last her efforts bore fruit. I've got it now, she said, with something of a triumph in her tone. It was the last week of November. I remember it because my brother-in-law got us a new job in the first week of December, and that was the following Monday. I heard that much about his job that I ought to know. French had scarcely doubted that this would prove to be the date, but it was most excellent to have it fixed in so definite a manner. He felt that he was progressing in his weaving of the net round the elusive Mrs. X. That's very good, he said approvingly. Now, will you tell me about Mr. Wayne? The girl sniffed. Him, she said scornfully. There ain't much to tell about him. He didn't trouble us much with his company. How was that? Did they not get on? Remember, we are speaking in confidence. Why, I never even saw him. He didn't turn up all the 3 months I was there. But I heard about him from Cook. He was away all the time, or next thing to it. When he did come, it was generally for 2 days. He would come late in the evening, so Cook said, and stay for 2 days without ever going so much as outside the door, and then go away again in the evening. You mean that if he came, say, on a Monday night, he would stay until the following Wednesday night? Yes, or sometimes for 3 days, so Cook said. What time in the evening would he come and go? About 10:30 he always came, and a little before 8 he left. Do you mean that he arrived and left at the same time on each visit? Yes, always about the same time. After dark? No, just at those times. It was the same summer and winter. At least that's all what Cook told me. We talked about it many times. She thought he was balmy. French was somewhat puzzled by this information. The whole story had what he called, with a fine disregard for metaphorical purity, a fishy ring. At first it had looked uncommonly like as if Mr. Wayne were paying clandestine visits to his own house, and if so, he might well be the man the old stage storekeeper had spoken of, and still have another establishment elsewhere. But this last answer seemed to suggest some other explanation of Wayne's mysterious movements. After a pause, French went on. Did it ever strike you he was trying to keep his visits secret? I can't say it did, the girl answered with apparent regret. Cook never said that. But, more hopefully, it might have been that, might not it? I don't know, French rejoined. I'm asking you. Miss Scott did not know either, but in her opinion, the inspector's suggestion might well be the truth. French noted the matter as one for future consideration as he continued his interrogation. What was Mr. Wayne like in appearance? Did Cook ever say? Cook, it appeared, had supplied information on this point also. Even French, who knew the ways of servants, was amazed at the detailed thoroughness with which these two had evidently discussed their employer's affairs. Mr. Wayne was tall, but stooped, with a sallow complexion, a heavy dark moustache, and glasses. As French listened to this description, an almost incredible idea flashed into his mind. He seemed to see a vision of the Duke and Peabody office in Amsterdam, and to hear again the voice of the dapper agent Crofts saying, a tall man but stooped, with a sallow complexion, a heavy dark moustache, and glasses. Could it be? Could this mysterious Mr. Wayne be none other than his old acquaintance Vanderkemp? For a time he sat motionless, lost in thought, as he considered the possibility. It would certainly clear up a good deal, that was mysterious in the case. It would account for Vanderkamp's actions previous to the murder, as well as his pull to Switzerland. It would supply a cause for Sylvia Duke's perturbation and for the postponement of the wedding. And it would explain how Mrs. Vane received a warning, Mr. Duke having stated he would, without delay, tell Vanderkamp of the discovery of Sissy Winter. The choice of the name Vane even tended in the same direction. There were advantages in an alias beginning with the same letter as a real name, lest an inadvertent initial on clothing or elsewhere should give the secret away. Moreover, the theory involved nothing inherently impossible. Vanderkamp was then, and had been for some time, ostensibly on an extended tour in the United States, so that, as far as he could see at present, an alibi was out of question. At first sight, it seemed to French as if he had hit on the solution of the mystery, but as he continued turning it over in his mind, he became less and less certain. Several important points were not covered by the theory. First of all, it did not, in his opinion, square with Vanderkamp's personality. The inspector had a very exalted opinion of his own powers as a reader of character, with considerable justification, it must be admitted, and the more he thought of Vanderkamp's bearing during their momentous interview at Barcelona, the more satisfied he felt of the traveller's innocence. He found it hard to believe further that a man who had just benefited to the extent of over £30,000 would be able to deny himself at least a very slight betterment in his standard of living. But the real difficulty was to connect Vanderkamp with Miss Winter's escapade with 16 diamonds. How did she receive them? She was in the Savoy building all the time between the theft at Hatton Garden and the traveller's departure from London, and it was therefore impossible that they could have met. Nor did French think it likely that so dangerous a package would have been entrusted to other hands or to the post. Here were undoubted objections to the theory. Nevertheless, French felt a pleasurable glow of excitement as he wondered if they could not be met, and if he really had not reached the last lap of his long investigation. He determined that his first action on reaching the yard would be to put the matter to the test. Having arrived at his decision, he turned again to Miss Scott. "I should like Cook's address, please." Miss Scott did not know Cook's address. She believed the woman lived somewhere down near Reading, but more than that she could not say, except that her name was Jane Hudson, and that she was small and stout and lively. French felt that if he wanted the woman, he could find her from this information. He scarcely hoped that she would be able to tell him more than the parlour maid, but thought that it might be worthwhile to have her looked up on chance, and he decided to give the necessary instructions to one of his men on his return to the yard. By this time it was evident that Miss Scott had exhausted her stock of information, and he presently took leave of her, having asked her to ring him up if she heard or saw anything either of Cook or of her former employers. Returning to the yard, he rang up the Hatton Garden office, and having obtained Vanderkamp's last known address, sent a cable to the United States Police asking that inquiry should be made as to the man's whereabouts. His next business was to find the man who had driven Mrs. Vane to Euston. A few minutes' walk took him to Gardiner Street, and he soon reached the cab rank. 5 vehicles were lined up, and he called the drivers together and explained his business. He took a strong line, demanding information as a right in his capacity of an officer of the CID. It had immediate effect. One of the drivers said that he and the man next on the rank were called to Crewe Lodge by a rather pretty girl about 4:30 on the afternoon in question. It looked as if the house was being closed. A lady, apparently the mistress, got into his friend's taxi and was driven off. Then the girl who had called him and a friend he took them to be servants entered his car and followed. He set the girl down at some street off Mathervale, Thistle Road or Mistletoe Road, he wasn't just sure, and took the other woman on to Paddington. The colleague who had driven the lady was not then on the stand, but he had been gone a considerable time and might turn up any moment. Would the inspector wait, or should the man be sent on to the yard on his return? French decided to wait, and in less than half an hour he was rewarded by the appearance of the car. Taximan James Tucker remembered the evening in question. He had followed his confrere to Crewe Lodge, and a lady whom he took to be the mistress of the house had entered his vehicle. The girl who had called him from the stand had told him to drive to Euston, and he had started off through Northgate and along Albert Road. But when he had nearly reached the station, the lady had spoken to him through the tube. She had said that she had changed her mind and would go on to St. Pancras. He had accordingly driven to the latter station, where the lady had paid him off. Had she any luggage? French asked. Yes, she had 2 or 3. The man could not be quite sure, but either 2 or 3 suitcases. No, there wouldn't be any note of them on his daily return, as they were carried inside the vehicle. The lady got a porter at St. Pancras, he believed, but he could not identify the man now. No, she had spoken to no one during the journey, and he could not suggest any reason why she should have changed her mind. Inquiries at St. Pancras seemed to French to be the next item on his program, and entering Tucker's vehicle, he was driven to the old Midland terminus. Where, French wondered, had his quarry been going? With Tucker's help, he fixed a few minutes before 5 as the hour of the lady's arrival, and then, after paying the man off, he went to the timetables to find out what trains left about that hour. In the nature of the case, a woman making a hurried flight from the attentions of the police, he thought it more than likely that the journey would have been to some distant place. While a very clever fugitive might recognize that a change to another part of London was perhaps the safest policy, the mentality of the average criminal leaned towards putting as many miles as possible between himself and the scene of his crime. It was by no means a sound deduction, but in the absence of anything better, he thought the main line trains should be first considered. He looked up the tables and was struck at once by the fact that an important express left at 5 p.m. It called at Nottingham, Chesterfield, Sheffield and Leeds, and there were connections to Harrogate, Bradford, Morecambe and Heysham for the Belfast boat. But any one of these places might be the starting point of some further journey, and unless he got a lead of some kind, it was quite hopeless to try to follow the traveller. Besides, she might not have gone by this train. There was a 5:05 stopping train to Northampton, a 5:35 to Nottingham, stopping at a number of intermediate places, and a 6:15 express to the north, not to mention local trains. No, he did not see that much was to be gained from the timetables. He made what inquiries he could at the station, exhibiting the lady's photograph to officials who were on duty when the trains in question were starting. It was of course a forlorn hope, and he was not greatly disappointed when it led to nothing. As another forlorn hope, he wired to the police at Nottingham, Chesterfield, Sheffield, Leeds, Harrogate, Bradford, Morecambe, Heysham, and Belfast, saying that the woman referred to in page 4 of the previous week's bulletin was believed to have gone to their respective towns, and urging that a vigilant lookout be kept for her. French once more felt baffled. Again in this exasperating case, he was left at a loose end. The information he gained always seemed to fail him at a critical moment. In something very like desperation, he sat down that evening at his desk and spent a couple of hours going through his notes of the case, wondering if by any chance he could find some further clue which he had hitherto overlooked. After careful thought, he decided that there was still one line of research unexplored, an unpromising line doubtless, but still a line. That list of dealings in the stock exchange. Could anything be made of that? Would, for example, the secretaries of the various firms be able to tell him who had carried out the transactions in question? If so, it should lead to Mrs. Swain or to someone who knew her intimately. He was not hopeful of the result, but he decided that if next day he had no other news, he would look into it. The end of chapter 16.